Good evening and welcome to a virtual town hall hosted by your 45th District legislators. Tonight, you'll be seeing and hearing from Senator Manka Dhingra and Representatives Larry Springer and Roger Goodman. Some of you have submitted questions in advance, and we will relay those questions to the lawmakers. You may also submit your questions live in the comments section of the platform you are watching on. Submit your questions now, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. Before we get started with questions, the lawmakers will give some brief opening remarks. Senator Dhingra.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our town hall. It is such a pleasure to be able to speak with all of you. And I just want to start by saying it is such an honor and a privilege to represent all of you in Olympia. And I'm very excited to talk about all the great work that we have been doing. I will start out by saying that I chair the Law and Justice Committee in the Senate. I sit on Ways and Means, and I also sit on the Behavioral Health Subcommittee. I am also honored to be the Deputy Majority Leader in the Senate. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Representative Larry Springer.
Thanks, Manka. Manka, I really appreciate that. And welcome, everyone. We have been doing these for many years now. The technology changes and improves each time we do it. So hopefully I won't make a mistake here, but it's really great to hear your questions. It's critically important that we hear from you folks. It's hard to do our job and do it well if we don't hear from you. So this is a good opportunity to share with us. I have been in the legislature now this is my 18th year. I am the Deputy Majority Leader. Like Senator Dhingra, I'm the Deputy Majority Leader in the House. I serve on the Appropriations Committee. That's the committee that determines how we spend our revenue. And I'm also on the Finance Committee, which is the committee that determines how we raise the revenue. And then I also serve on the Agricultural and Natural Resources Committee and am a member of our 8-person leadership team for the House Democratic Caucus. So with that, I'll turn it over to Roger.
Thanks very much, Larry, and good evening, everyone. Again, I'm Roger Goodman, and Larry has said that he has served in the House for 18 years. I'm the junior member of the House. I've only served for 16 years. I do have to say that Manka and Larry and I work extraordinarily well together. In some other legislative districts, the members don't really get along too much, and they're not that effective. And so the three of us are communicating very frequently with one another, and we each have our own niche in terms of issue areas. And I hope that we're serving the district very well. I serve as the chair of the House Public Safety Committee and have for many years, with jurisdiction over our criminal legal system, dealing with community safety and policing and crime and justice. Also on the Judiciary Committee. It's called the Civil Rights and Judiciary Committee. I'm one of the few lawyers in the legislature, believe it or not. Manka is another one of the few lawyers in the legislature. And also on the Children, Youth, and Families Committee. My focus just in general is to keep our communities safe and to make sure that children are well fed and housed and ready for school and success in life. Looking forward to your questions, and thanks very much for your attention.
All right, our first question tonight comes from Tom. What is the summary of your progress to provide assistance for the mentally ill who need healthcare facilities rather than jail?
Thank you so much for that question, Tom. I'm going to take that. In the Senate 3 years ago, we actually created a behavioral health subcommittee to really make sure we're going to be very focused and have a long-term plan and a strategic plan for the manner in which we are going to address behavioral health in our state. So I was honored to chair that committee, and it was a very hard decision when I was offered the chair of Law and Justice, but I did take the chair of the Law and Justice Committee position. So in the last few years, what we have been doing is really taking a concerted effort at looking at every single point of entry into the behavioral health system. And we're talking about from the time of pregnancy, birth, all the way to the end of life and taking a look at our elderly. Along that entire continuum, we are also taking a look at making sure we have early intervention, making sure we have points of interaction at every level. And I'm so excited about the bill that the House has passed and sent over to the Senate called Assisted Outpatient Treatment. And this is an attempt to make sure that we are providing services to individuals prior to them requiring to be hospitalized and prior to them getting arrested. And so this is going to be a huge component in our continuum to make sure that we are getting people treatment when they want it instead of waiting for them to hit rock bottom. We are also working on a bill that I sent over to the House, and I know it got out of the policy committee and is sent to appropriations. And that is taking a look at those individuals that are involved in our forensic mental health system and really trying to have an outpatient program for them as well. So we really have been trying for the last 3 years, very specifically trying to shift our system away from criminalization to early intervention, because we know that having a behavioral health crisis is not illegal. And we have to acknowledge that reality and treat that reality in the most appropriate way. So I can talk a lot more, but there's been a lot of focus on children's mental health. And there's a lot of great work coming out of the Youth and Children's Mental Health Task Force. And so a lot more on it, but I'll just say it's a very exciting time for the investments that we're making in behavioral health in our state. We have the new 988 number, and that's going to be operational this summer. So lots more on it, and a lot more that we, again, continue to do and need to do. And I'll just say the workforce shortage is a huge issue that is really impeding our ability to do a lot more.
I also wanted to comment on this. Manka and I have been working together on this, what I call decriminalization of mental illness. Too often, the mentally ill and those suffering from substance use disorder fall into the criminal system, being arrested and unfortunately incarcerated. We do have a couple of grant programs and hopefully expanding funding for that to intervene with people who really are in deep trouble, acute crisis, maybe even living on the streets, to provide peer intervention and what we call harm reduction to make to intervene before they get arrested. But if they are arrested and if they're brought to the jail, we now are expanding more therapeutic options, triage facilities and other therapeutic facilities instead of jail. And also what we call the warm handoff. If someone is in jail and suffers from a behavioral health crisis, that they're not just released from jail onto the streets, but sent into a therapeutic facility where they get a proper care. We've also made clear in legislation this year that's now moving through the legislature to for police when they show up on a mental health crisis to provide the necessary assistance to mental health providers to make sure that they get evaluated, transported to a safe location so they're not a danger to themselves or others. So we're making progress on decriminalizing mental illness.
Our next question comes from Mamta. Washington has flourished economically in the last few years due to a huge immigrant presence. What does our state stand on supporting immigration generally?
So maybe I'll take an initial stab at that. Mamta, thanks for the question. The largest employer in the state of Washington is the agricultural industry, which could not survive were it not for immigrant labor. We have gone to great lengths to make sure that the immigrant labor in our farm agricultural industry is, number one, here legally and are well treated when they get here. We have stood up over several years ago an e-verify system to help farm owners verify the legal presence of immigrants. We've worked on a number of issues to improve the quality of farm worker housing. We have, I don't know how many task forces that we have created to really study the application of pesticides to keep farm workers safe. And at the end of the day, we have an agricultural industry that is second to none in the nation. We grow more crops in this state than any other state in the nation. And we grow the highest value dollar crops in the nation. Those would be our apples and our cherries. And none of that would be possible without immigrant labor. And I think Manka may have another sector to talk about.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for that question, Mamta. As when I got elected, I doubled the Women of Color Caucus in the Senate from 1 to 2. So I love to take any opportunity to talk about the amazing economic contributions, not even, let alone the cultural contributions that immigrants make to our population. And I just want to say this one statistic before I begin, and that is about 1 in 7 Washington residents is an immigrant, while another 1 in 7 residents is a native-born U.S. citizen with at least one immigrant parent. And I'll just say that in Washington, all of our programs, our policies, they impact all Washingtonians. We don't make distinctions between citizens and non-citizens. In those cases where the federal government does have barriers to non-citizens accessing resources, we actually do quite a bit to make sure that we are supplementing that as a state to make sure we're taking care of all Washingtonians, because we know that all Washingtonians really have been working hard to improve our economy. And I'll just have to say, take a look at the tech industry. I know, especially in the 45th district, we see a lot of immigrants in the tech sector. While we have immigrants in all aspects of our economy, I think there's a huge component of it. So I just want to say that from a state perspective, we like to work for all Washingtonians.
I wanted to comment on this as well. Manka mentioned our tech sector. Microsoft, as the largest corporation in our area, employs people from 157 countries. And many of those foreign-born look different from those who were born in the United States, the majority white population. And I really regret that there's an anti-immigrant sentiment in this country, and discrimination and bias against people who are perhaps have different skin color. And those who work in the tech sector may be a little bit more affluent, highly educated, and highly paid, but they are also concerned about this anti-immigrant sentiment. And we've seen nationwide and in our state a lot of hate speech and hate crimes addressed at immigrants. And we are addressing this in the legislature, and also protecting against needless law enforcement activity against those who are foreign-born or who are people of color. So we care about all people equally, and equity, social equity, and racial equity are one of our top priorities in the legislature.
All right. Our next question comes from Jerome. What are you doing to increase affordable housing given how difficult it is to buy a house right now?
So I'll maybe lead off, and I'm sure my cohorts here will have plenty to say, because the topic of housing affordability has literally dominated the legislature in the last 2 years, actually longer than that, but especially acute in the last 2 years. We have an affordability crisis second to none in the nation. In fact, Bellevue has just surpassed California's San Francisco as the most expensive housing market in the nation. And it is a terrible burden for families to bear that are not overtly wealthy. So the legislature has tried a number of initiatives. We don't build housing. We don't know how to do that. But what we do is appropriate money to send out to housing builders, primarily private nonprofit, low income and affordability builders. Just in this last year, we have appropriated $364 million to help families who are in houses now, but because of COVID, we're facing losses of jobs. So we've got rent assistance. We put $500 million into the capital budget in the House this year to help build additional housing, another 1,500 units probably coming online. And I'd be remiss, though, if I didn't point out that one of the key players in any kind of housing affordability effort are our local government partners. Because at the end of the day, the housing will always be built in some local government somewhere. So we have to work really carefully with our local governments on zoning. We have passed a couple of bills to pursue transit-oriented development. We certainly have done that in Kirkland and Redmond, as well as accessory dwelling units. So Lots to say about this, but it is something that really takes up a lot of our time.
I'll comment briefly on this as well. There is legislation that is probably not going to move through this year, but is very important to remove the ban on density in cities near transit zones, to have duplexes, fourplexes, sixplexes, to make sure that we have more density, particularly, again, near transit areas. There's two objectives, and they're difficult to reconcile with one another. One is density, and the other is affordability. And in our area, we are densifying, but it's very difficult at the same time to have affordable housing. And so the current legislation that we were considering might have incentivized more density near transit zones, but not necessarily have them be affordable. And affordable housing is really important in our area because we don't necessarily have the socioeconomic diversity that we need. It's too expensive to live here, and so many people who work here have to travel long distances because they can't afford to live here. So we need to work both on density to preserve our critical areas outside of the urban growth boundaries, but also affordability. This is one of the biggest challenges we face, and we're still working on it.
And I'll just add a little bit to that with, including everything that both the representatives have said. It's going to take every single one of us to address the housing crisis at the city level, the county level, the state level, but also individuals. We really need individuals to be comfortable not living in the McMansions and being comfortable with having higher density in their neighborhoods. And so it is really something that everyone is going to have to step up and take some responsibility for. And I'll just say, I am just always so pleased with the 45th district that they are willing to really make sure that they are actively working on solving problems. Our cities are really great partners with us. And I truly do believe that the residents are really great partners and have a real interest in solving this issue. So thank you for that.
Our next question comes to us from Angela. When will the light rail be running on the east side?
The trains are running now. They are just not carrying anybody yet because they are all test runs. But if you happen to be in Bellevue at the right time, you may see a light rail train coming through town, as Sound Transit is now running test runs. Service should be starting here later this year and should be extended on out to Redmond sometime next year. So we're within a year of seeing trains run at peak times, by the way, at 8-minute intervals, estimated to carry 40 to 50,000 people a day.
I'll just add that I, for one, can't wait. I am so excited to have those trains running. And I'll just do a plug for the transportation package that the Senate has sent over to the House, because what it does have in there is a provision where our youth can ride for free. And to me, that is critical, because if we need to change the culture, we have to start getting our children ready, willing, and excited to take public transportation. I know both my kids take public transportation, and so I'm hoping that all of this will incentivize all of us to ride the train more often once we get it.
Now, the light rail is coming into Bellevue and Redmond, but not to Kirkland. And yet we do have what we call bus rapid transit that's going to be developed as a link to the light rail coming into Kirkland as well. So it's all going to be multimodal and linked to one another.
Our next question comes to us from Naz. What is your agenda to support small businesses growing in your area?
Let me start with that one, because we have a couple of bills in the Senate that I am excited to talk about. We had a bill that provided $214 million in unemployment insurance tax relief for businesses across Washington. Just today, we heard a bill in Ways and Means about providing, again, B&O relief for small businesses. And, this is something that we're all very committed on doing, because we know that the small businesses are the backbone of our economy. And the one thing I will mention also is that, when COVID hit, The Senate created a special committee on economic recovery, and we were really taking a look at, especially during COVID, the manner in which it was impacting small businesses and what we could do in terms of recovery from after the pandemic. And so we were really making sure we're targeting those businesses that actually suffered. So really taking a look at a surgical tool rather than treating all businesses the same, because we do know that some of our larger businesses, some of our online retailers did well, while our hospitality and the small businesses really struggled. So there's a lot of dollars last year and this year in making sure we're providing that much needed relief for small businesses.
And during the onset of COVID in 2020, when most businesses were shut down, especially in the hospitality industry, as Manka mentioned, we passed an emergency relief package of $220 million, and we sent it out to small businesses in the very first week of the 2021 legislative session. We have followed that up this year with another $200 million in small business relief in the form of grants. We have also delayed the requirement for businesses to renew their licenses. Licensing is expensive. So we have allowed businesses to ride on the previous license for another year. And we are always looking for opportunities where we can cut costs for them. And the most recent one will be around, again, rent relief for some of the smallest of the small businesses. These are mom and pops, especially in small town Washington. And the needs for the small business community in the Bellevue, Kirkland, Redmond, 45th District are appreciably different than they are in Pend Oreille County. So we have to be careful that we craft this in a way that helps every business in Washington.
Yeah, and the House budget that is actually going to be voted on Saturday, we are providing $200 million of one-time relief again to the hospitality industry, our restaurants and our lodging, and other relief for other sectors that were particularly hard hit during the COVID pandemic, including, for instance, our arts organizations, music and arts, and the film industry and so forth. So we've gotten an infusion of federal funds, and we have more revenue coming in because of our strong economy here, and we're able to provide that cushion for those sectors that were really particularly hard hit during the pandemic.
Our next question comes to us from a YouTube viewer. MB2433 asks, please comment on HB 2037 and SB 5919. Are these rolling back progress from last year or just providing clarifications on last year's police reforms? More specifically, how will these improve overall public safety?
Yes, well, in 2021, in response to the murder of George Floyd the year before, and the murder of Breonna Taylor, and so many other regrettable incidents of death at the hands of police around the country, we had national protests in the streets, actually around the world. And it was an imperative for us in 2021 to enact a broad suite of bills to hold accountable police who engage in misconduct and who use excessive force, to provide more transparency to the public, to prohibit certain questionable tactics, to create affirmative duties. Actually, that was Manka's bill, the duty to report misconduct, the duty for officers to intervene when they see excessive force. And I think most importantly, we've created a new accountability structure on the state level so that if there is misconduct, police can be sanctioned and maybe even decertified or having their license taken away. None of that has disappeared. We still have all of these strong accountability structures. We've still prohibited these questionable tactics and imposing these affirmative duties and creating transparency. We're going to have databases open to the public to see what's going on between police and the community. But over the interim, in the last 7 or 8 months, we did hear from police a couple of things that they needed in order to be able to do their jobs. One was this question about mental health and whether they can intervene on a mental health crisis call. and also whether they could protect vulnerable children who are either in the streets or who are being abused in homes. And we are moving legislation through right now that makes it clear that police can continue to do the great job they were doing before on mental health crisis calls and to protect children. And also a bill that I've sponsored that's also now moving through that allows police to use force. Force sounds violent, but it's basically hands-on. Force cannot be unreasonable, and we've established a very clear standard on this. Police, when they detain a suspect, when they detain a criminal suspect, what's been happening is these suspects simply walk away or run away because of the wording of the statute. So we're going to be changing the wording of the law so that police can physically interact with criminal suspects who are obligated to, they don't have to answer questions, but they're not able to leave. Police have the constitutional authority to detain people for questioning. So that's one slight adjustment that will help police do criminal investigations much more effectively. The other need that police said is, well, particularly for violent offenses, is the ability to pursue vehicles, to engage in vehicle pursuits. Most vehicle pursuits are for non-violent offenses. We're not going to allow that. We're not going to be chasing small crimes, but if someone engages in or is about to engage in a violent offense, we want to give police the ability to pursue in a vehicle. However, we're building into the legislation all sorts of other protective measures so that the pursuit cannot be more dangerous than the risk of not apprehending the person. And that bill is also moving through, again, limiting it only to violent offenses and making it quite difficult, actually, to engage in vehicle pursuits. Vehicle pursuits are inherently dangerous, and we want to limit them as much as possible, but also account for the need to prevent violent crime. And so I think we've struck the balance with those two bills, but it is not a rollback by any means. All of the other measures we put in place for police accountability and improving police community relations and ensuring that police treat all communities equitably, all of those measures are still in place. And so these are small adjustments which will help community safety.
Thank you for that, Roger. And I'm going to continue on that because the 45th District has a huge representation in working on law and justice issues. And I agree with Roger. Absolutely. It's not a rollback. We passed 14 police accountability bills last session, and there are just a few that needs clarification. And so I want to be very, very clear. A lot of the concerns, the hesitation that we saw from law enforcement was not because we limited their ability at all. It was about their concern about liability. That's what was driving a lot of the hesitancy that we saw. And it was not consistent. We had different areas of our state where we had law enforcement agencies who said, you know what, they can do their job. And there are others that were more reluctant to do so. So what we have before us this session is that critical clarification in ensuring that our officers can engage, and we encourage them to engage in community caretaking function. And the second one, as Roger talked about, was really about making sure we're clarifying the use of force and in what circumstances that force can be used. But I'll just say, especially in the 45th District, I think our cities, our law enforcement officers have been doing a really great job for quite a few years. So many of them have gone through the extended crisis intervention training. So many of them are really the guardians of the community that we expect them to be. And so I do want to specifically put that shout out to our local law enforcement officers, because when we talk about police accountability, people just talk about law enforcement in general. But I will say that a lot of the policies that we enacted last year, our law enforcement officers were already doing. It was part, a lot of them were already a part of the policies and procedures. And so I just want to make sure we're all very clear that we're very proud of the work that the law enforcement officers in the 45th District have been doing.
And I'll just say the 45th is incredibly lucky to have two of the finest criminal justice minds in the legislature working on it. So Manka and Roger are the go-to people for this.
Our next question comes from John and Laura. Do you support HB 1789, which would provide a property tax exemption for nonprofit adult family homes serving people with intellectual or developmental disabilities?
John and Laura, absolutely. And I don't know if you might be the couple that came to see me about this issue during the summer. And we talked about it. It turns out that it particularly affects some long-term care homes in Issaquah. And so I turned that bill over to Representative Ramos and Representative Callan, who represent the 5th District that have that. They brought the bill to the floor of the House, and it's already passed. We voted for it. And if I'm not mistaken, it went out of the House unanimously or very close to it. So it's on its way.
And I'll just say, I am happy to vote for it in the Senate.
John, I got your email the other day. I haven't answered it. Sorry about that. Maybe I'll answer your email right here, right now. Yes, support it strongly. Thanks for your advocacy for the developmentally disabled, and hope your daughter is doing well.
Our next question comes from YouTube. Senj asks, while the intent of Washington Cares Fund was great, the execution left much to be desired. It caused a scramble for your residents. What are we going to do to ensure the next rollout is better through?
I'll begin here. This is a complicated issue. It's also very frustrating because on the one hand, when this idea began to evolve, everyone sort of applauded the notion that we were trying to establish basically a security or an insurance type policy to cover costs in long-term care, which most of us will need something from by the time we get there. And we're woefully unprepared for that. So this was a good idea. You're right. The execution was not as good as it should have been. We have put a stop to it. We've paused it right now. We have put it off for 1.5 years. And during that time, we have an advisory committee of people who are expert actuarial analysts who will look at the program and bring back a proposal to the legislature in 2023 to reinstitute the program later that year. I think embedded in the question was whether or not the rate, the 0.58% rate for the payroll deduction will stay. We have every intention of trying to keep that there, which is why the House in our budget this year has appropriated $300 million. And we're using that, actually that's for paid family leave, but they are slightly connected in the sense that we go to school on paid family leave in terms of how to create a long-term care program. And they'll come back with some answers later on for the legislature in 2023. And hopefully we can avoid some of the pitfalls, things like the opt-out, which was probably not such a good idea. We'll have to figure out how to do that. So we know we kind of dropped the ball on this one, and we're determined to fix it.
Being first in the nation is hard on this. I might have some views that are different from Larry and Manka. I'm pretty concerned about the sustainability of this long-term care program on the state level. The opt-out, as Larry said, was quite limited. The amount of the benefit is also quite limited. So we have a lot of work to do, but I do strongly believe that we should have a statewide long-term care insurance program. But I'm going to have to wait and see how because we've pushed it out to evaluate it more and come up with a better structure and better function. But I'm still on the fence on this one.
And I'll just add to this. There's a silver tsunami coming. We know that, and no disrespect to anyone, it's going to be really expensive. And the way we make sure we take care of individuals that are aging is making sure that they can age in their home. It is cheaper for the state, and it is so much better for the individual. The individuals want to do that. So the longer we can make sure that individuals are staying in their home and getting the care that they need at the level that they need, the better off we all are economically as a state, as well as from a humane perspective for the individual. So we need a long-term care act. I think there's a broad agreement on that. And the other thing I'll just want to point out is when we passed that bill, it was years before anyone had ever heard about COVID. And so the circumstances changed so dramatically by the time the implementation date came around. And so I think what the legislature did was a responsible thing to do, where we extended it out to make sure that we can do the work necessary to get it done right. And I am very proud that of the fact that Washington leads the nation in so many different areas. And this, again, is an example of one where we are leading the nation. And we will make sure we take the time to do it right. But it is the right economic as well as humane move to make for our population.
Our next question comes from Jim. What is in the transportation bills to help people on the east side?
I'll start there. The House just passed some legislation out of committee that will extend a sales tax deferment on the sales tax that would be due on the construction of the two big projects in the 405 corridor. That will allow that project to get back on track after the effects of COVID. The COVID shutdown literally decimated our toll revenue, which was what maintains 405. It decimated the toll revenue on 167. So there is a large project that's been in the works for 405 and 167 that will now get back on schedule. And the sales tax that will be deferred to the builder will have to be paid back 5 years after the project is done, plus interest. But it will allow that builder to get his or her machinery back onto the roadway. That will result in widening of 405 through the S-curves, an extra lane on 167, and a continuous integrated toll lane so that when you enter 405 in Linwood, you can run the toll lane on the same side of the highway, what a concept, all the way to Puyallup. So it will be a huge boon to what has been one of the most congested stretches of freeway on the West Coast for the last 2 decades. So we have found a way, I think, to finesse this and get back on track.
I can't wait for the 520, 405, that freeway to really declog a lot of the traffic in our area. And we all know that people just don't stay in the area in which they live. We drive through our cities all the time. And so when we take a look at the transportation budget, it really is about taking a look at the entire sector and how all our roads, our cities, our counties are interconnected and how we are moving people consistently throughout our region. And this is why the multimodal function is so important. We talked about the light rail, and I think we have to continue to talk about the light rail. We have to talk about our public buses. We have to talk about bike lanes. We have to talk about trails and absolutely the freeways. And so I'm actually very excited about the transportation package that we have. And I can tell you, people have worked for a year and a half to make sure we get here.
For those of you who ride your bikes or go jogging or walking on the trails, the 42-mile stretch all the way from Renton to Snohomish, that used to be the dinner train. I'm not sure how many of you remember riding the dinner train. Will be completely connected for as a bike lane, and I ride that trail all the time myself through Kirkland. But on 405 and on 520, we're looking forward to the completion on 520 of the 148th interchange, including a bicycle pedestrian bridge. And then on 405 on 132nd, further to the north as well. So there's a lot of work underway on the freeways.
Our next question comes to us from Mitch. How are you going to address the recent higher theft in King County? Catalytic converters, petty theft, and home intrusion.
I'll start there. There's a bill that began in the House. I heard it in my committee, House Bill 1815, related to catalytic converter theft. It began as a study that we were going to have the Attorney General convene people, sit around the table, and talk about what are we going to do about catalytic converter theft. That's not enough. That's the form in which we passed it out of the House, but it has just gone through Manka's committee and beefed up considerably so that we will be imposing criminal penalties not only on those who stealing catalytic converters, because those are the low-level operators. Deterring them isn't really going to make the difference. We have to go against those who are purchasing the stolen catalytic converters and taking the rare earth minerals, which are very highly valuable, and a lot of it's being shipped across the Pacific. So going at the problem at its root, and also comprehensively, a multi-jurisdictional law enforcement approach, including federal, both Homeland Security and FBI, as well as our state law enforcement. But be interested to hear what's going on in Manka's committee, because that's the latest stop of this bill.
Thank you. Yes, we actually exec this bill out of committee today, earlier this morning. And we're also taking a look at online sales and making sure the Attorney General's office is involved in addressing that. There is not a very clear understanding of how these catalytic converters are moving within the state. So really taking a look at possession, sale, as well as online sale, and then making sure we have a work group that is trying to put together and really understand and study where the holes may be as we implement this bill that hopefully will pass very soon. And in terms of the other thefts that were mentioned, I'll just say crime, unfortunately, is up everywhere in the country. And this is something that happens very often, unfortunately, when there has been a great negative issue like the COVID. You know, we've had economic instability, we've had inequity. And so, unfortunately, crime is up everywhere in the country. But I will say that, again, 45th District, the state of Washington, we continue to be a safe community overall.
Yeah, the crime statistics, actually, you have to take a close look. Yes, because of the COVID pandemic, we've had some disorder and some increases in some categories of crime. But the report from the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs shows that there's actually been a decline in most categories of crime. And actually, if you take a look at 2021 versus 2019, because 2020 was a very unusual year, there had been a decline in most categories of crime. The crime that I'm most concerned about, and I think Manka agrees with me, is domestic violence. We've had a terrible increase in homicide, fatal incidents because of access to firearms. And when you have firearms and domestic violence mix, it gets lethal. And so we really need to be concerned about domestic violence, homicide, and also a gang-related activity. It's been very difficult to go into communities and do the suppression and other interactions with gangs. You can't try to do gang intervention online. It has to be in person. And so unfortunately, not in our area, but in other areas in South King County and other parts of the state, there have been some unfortunate incidents of homicide in the open public, people literally shooting each other in the streets. Because we haven't been able to intervene as we had before. As the pandemic wanes, we'll be able to intervene again and suppress that. But I'm most concerned about domestic violence.
And this is one area that, again, Roger and I do a lot of work on. As many of you know, I was one of the founders of API Chaya that helps survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and trafficking. And so this is an issue that's very close to my heart. And last year, again, Roger and I had this really big protection order bill. This year, we have a bill that I'm so proud of that really acknowledges that coercive control is a very important component of domestic violence, and we have to make sure that that survivors are able to get a protection order because of the coercive control that they suffer in these relationships. So a lot more work to be done in the domestic violence arena, but yes, that is the crime that has gone up by 30% last year. And so really making sure, again, we're targeting our efforts strategically to address the specific crimes that are occurring. We're talking about catalytic converters that we have a bill on, domestic violence that we have a bill on. And I'll just pitch that a couple of years ago, we created the Office of Firearm Violence Safety. And there's actually a lot of grant dollars that are going in specifically into that office to take a look at early intervention in those areas where there may be high violence. And this gets to the gang issue, because there are programs that actually are working in King County, and now I believe we funded this last year in Central Washington, and another one in the southern part of our state, that is taking a look and engaging with our youth that may be susceptible to entering into a life of crime. The program's called Choose 180, a lot of other these great programs that we've had a lot of work sessions on and that we are funding to really get ahead of violence and have early intervention programs that can help.
Our next question comes to us from Nancy. What is your position on the safe staffing bill for nurses? Won't it make the current shortage of nurses even worse?
Well, thanks, Nancy, for the question. This is a tough one because we have two problems happening at the same time. One is the nursing shortage. There's a shortage in so many different sectors. And we hear about work shortages all across our economy. And yet, those nurses who are on the job, it's unbearable for them. There's incredible burnout, and we need to provide relief for them. And so if there may be a shortage, that's one issue, but we can't wait to provide relief to nurses to make sure that there are adequate staff in the hospitals, because patient safety comes first. And so if we don't have the proper ratio between staff and patients, particularly after the pandemic now, the burnout will continue, nurses will quit, and so the shortage is not really even relevant there. We have to have nurses willing to stay on the job. And so we have enacted legislation in the House, passed it over to the Senate to make sure that there are reasonable staffing requirements so that patient safety is taken care of, that there are enough nurses on staff to take care of patients. In the meanwhile, we are increasing the pipeline for nurses. Actually, here on the East Side, we have Lake Washington Institute of Technology, and then, of course, there are other nursing programs, Northwest University, helping to fill that pipeline for nurses coming into the system. But on a day-to-day basis, right now, I'm concerned about patient safety, and I want to make sure that there are enough staff in the hospitals to take care of those patients adequately.
You know, I just want to take this moment to really thank our healthcare workers. I, for one, can't even imagine what they have been going through on a day-to-day basis. And not just our nurses and our doctors, but all the support staff that work in our healthcare field. And I know it's been challenging for all of us, but for those individuals who are really taking care of the sick, I just want to take this moment and thank you all for your dedication and your hard work. I think the bottom line on this issue about is really, I think there is a common value, right? I think hospitals want to treat their nurses well. Nurses want to be able to do the best job they can, and it doesn't help anybody if they're overworked. And so I think it is critical to make sure we are taking care of the caregivers. And so unfortunately, the biggest problem is a lack of individuals in this industry. And so I'll just do a shout out to anyone who is thinking of going to college, or those teenagers who may be chiming in. Think of nursing. Think of getting into the healthcare industry. Your skill set will be greatly appreciated and much needed.
The state is trying to do what we can. We're somewhat limited, but we're trying to expand the nurse training facilities at both WSU and the University of Washington, and the new Behavioral Health Center in North Seattle. And we're also looking at legislation, and have passed some in the past, but we need to do a better job now of expanding what we refer to as reciprocity, meaning nurses from other states can come in and go to work quickly rather than having to take tests and be recertified. So we're trying to do what we can to expand and quickly beef up the nursing staff. But Roger and Manka are right. It is a devastating problem that we need to address. So we're doing what we can, I think, at the moment.
Our next question comes to us from Philip. What is your plan for tackling our state's lack of an income tax, which overly burdens the sales tax?
This is a question I have been struggling with and have probably answered at every town hall for 18 years, and logically so, legitimately so. We have arguably the most regressive tax system in the nation. We might be second only to Mississippi, which is
Tennessee.
Did Tennessee overtake Mississippi?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
At any rate, no matter where that is, we should not be proud of that. The reason we have the most regressive tax system, one of the most in the nation, is that we rely on two major taxes, both very regressive. One is sales tax, which disproportionately impacts low-income families, and the B&O tax, which is the tax on business gross receipts without any recognition of whether the business made a profit or not. Those two are very regressive. I have advocated for an overhaul of our entire tax system, not just little pieces of it, but the whole thing, top to bottom, for years. 3 years ago, Representative Noel Frame from the 36th District in Seattle put together legislation to create a tax reform work group. I know another statewide work group doesn't sound too exciting, but I can tell you that by next year, that work group will come with a proposal after having traveled around the state this year with a revamped tax system. That what I hope will show is that if we institute other types of taxes, we can lower sales tax and maybe even get rid of the B&O tax. So we are excited to see what that proposal will be. And I envision them going out to a community and say, here's the current tax structure. Here's the new one. For your family, which one works best for you? And you tell us. And that should inform the legislature in 2023 where we should take our revamped tax system.
I'll just add to this. Every year I have a lot of teens that actually will pitch bill ideas to me. And I'm very proud to say that I sponsor at least one or two of our youth's ideas in the legislature. This year, I had a class, students at Lake Washington High School, who really wanted to talk about an income tax. And they had one of the best presentations that I have ever seen about the data and the reasoning, and it was solid. There was no logical argument as to why they had a bad idea. And then I asked them the question. I said, I said, how many of you would be interested in this? And all their hands went up. And I said, how many of your parents would be interested in this? And they just kind of looked at me. And I said, I want you to go home and give the same presentation to your parents and then get back to me. And so I think there's a lot to be said about policies where there's a difference between the facts and what is actually going to be good versus the emotional response people have. I think this is certainly one of them. And I look forward to Larry's proposal where you have an A and a B and you pick the right one.
All right. Probably our last question from the night is going to come to us from Jane. What piece of legislation is each of you most proud of, and what is one bill or issue that you will be working on for next year?
I guess I'll start. Manka already mentioned this one. It's House Bill 1901. Last year, I sponsored House Bill 1320 to make sure that victims and survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, and I have to say that if there's harm in our communities, statistically, who's getting harmed in our communities? These are victims and survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, and also drunk driving. Those statistically are where people are getting harmed. We hear about sort of the sensational violent crimes happening, making the headline news, but on a daily basis, it's really about domestic violence and sexual assault. Last year and the year before during the pandemic, the courthouses were closed and the victims did not have access to the courthouses to get courts to issue them protection orders, which keep the perpetrator apart, the abuser apart from the victim. And so the courts got innovative and went online and temporarily created abilities to seek these protection orders and have the hearings online and to issue them. And it worked extremely well so that survivors and victims don't have to choose between healthcare, childcare, or going to work and going to the courthouse. They can do it online. The bill that I passed last year makes that permanent. This year, we've made further improvements to this system, but also a new policy change that Manka mentioned earlier to include in the definition of domestic violence what we call coercive control. When we think of domestic violence, it's usually, we think of physical violence, but in fact, psychological and emotional abuse are more frequent and more traumatic. And so we are going to be including in the definition of domestic violence this notion of coercive control, financial exploitation, using technology to monitor the victim, threatening friends and family and pets, so many other things. And I think this will provide even more protection so that victims can go to the court and get a protection order against someone who is really trying to manipulate their life and threaten them, even without hitting them, and also get it early so that it doesn't escalate to greater violence. So making a lot of progress in protecting survivors and victims of domestic violence and sexual assault in particular. House Bill 1901.
I'm going to share a few, a few numbers with you. My apologies to my cohorts here who have heard me share these numbers about a dozen times. In the 1990s, wildfire in the state of Washington burned about 84,000 acres a year. The next decade, it burned about 189,000 acres a year. In the early 2010s, that number went up to 490,000 acres a year on average. And in 2020 alone, we burned 812,000 acres due to wildfire. This is a catastrophe. It is directly attributable to climate change as well as forest health. So last year, I introduced and passed a bill, House Bill 1168, that will appropriate $125 million per biennium ongoing to give the Department of Natural Resources the resources they need to, number one, attack a fire quickly with better equipment. They are currently flying helicopters in Washington state that flew in the Vietnam War. So we are going to help them buy upgraded equipment with larger tanks, hire more firefighters. There is money in there for ongoing forest health to get into our forests, clean them out, clear them, do controlled burning, make the forest more resilient. There is money in there to help communities like the poor town of Malden, which was destroyed in 3 hours, to have better building materials to be more resilient. That bill just passed last year. We hope to see some results of that in the coming years. This next year, my highest priority will be another natural resource bill, which is the recovery of salmon habitat. We're working really hard on a comprehensive program to restore eelgrass beds, buffer widths in riparian habitat, and try and bring our salmon back. So that will keep me busy for the next year or two.
Thank you. This is actually a really great question because I do love talking about, of course, we all love talking about the bills that we sponsor. The one that I'm very passionate about this session is one on cyber harassment and cyber stalking. This is becoming and has been becoming such a huge issue for, in our community. And so this really updates our cyber stalking law and really categorize it as cyber harassment, which is what it is. And there's a lot of work being done in this arena in our state, and we're just seeing the incidence of cyber harassment really escalating. And so it is in the House. I believe it passed out of committee and should be on the in rules. The issue that I'm excited on working for next session, I know I mentioned assisted outpatient treatment already, is really the implementation of a 988 system. This is the alternative to 911 for behavioral health crisis that people in our state will be able to call starting in the summer, and really making sure we're building out the infrastructure that provides for next day appointments, provides for individuals who are answering the call, who are trained professionals who can engage in de-escalation, who can provide treatment, therapy, have mobile crisis response, and really have a statewide behavioral health response. And that is something we haven't been doing as a state. We've been leaving a lot of the behavioral health responses to the cities, the counties, and to different regions. So I'm very excited about that for next session. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone who participated in our virtual town hall. I'm going to now turn it back over to the legislators for closing remarks. Senator Dhingra, would you like to go first?
Thank you so much. I once again want to thank all of you for participating. I know we got a lot of questions, a lot of comments. There were a lot of repeat topics, so hopefully we covered all of them. I just want to say truly is an honor and a privilege to represent all of you in Olympia. I also want to say that, you know, as a state, we, for the last few years, have the highest bond rating we've ever had as a state, AAA bond rating, because we are being fiscally responsible. At the same time, we've been rated the #1 state for employers, as well as the #1 state for employees. That is not a distinction many states get to have. We are leading the nation when it comes to access to democracy. We are leading the nation when it comes to access to healthcare, reproductive justice. There is so much in our state that we have to be proud of. We had the first case of COVID in our state, and yet we have one of the fewest death rates. We have some of the best economic recovery in the country. And so I know when many times when we attend these events, we do get a lot of individuals who are frustrated because people are frustrated, and that's true. But I am an optimist, and I just want to say I am very proud of the work that is being done in Washington, and we truly should feel honored and privileged to live in this great state. Thank you.
I was going to let the junior representative from the 45th go next.
Okay, fine. Well, thanks to all of you for paying close attention and for engaging in this civil discourse. It's been a tough time, right? Right now we're seeing an unprovoked military assault on a democratic nation. And we're even seeing the Chinese now flying jets over Taiwan. So it's a very difficult time all around because of the pandemic, the economic disruption, attempts to undermine the democracy of our own nation, racial discord. These are going to be historic times that we look upon, and how did we survive it? But when you take a look at Washington State compared to the rest of the country, we have an enlightened political discourse, we have a favorable climate, we have a vibrant economy, and we are buffered in some way from the misfortune of other places. And in the legislature, we're working hard to preserve that quality of life and to enhance it. People are always going to be dissatisfied. Politics isn't about all or nothing. We have to make compromises. But in a collaborative fashion, I think we're solving, or at least addressing, some of the most pressing problems. And we're going to continue to press forward.
I'll just wrap up by saying one of the things that comes up often is the political discourse or lack of civil political discourse coming out of Washington, D.C. That is not the case in this Washington. If you come down to Olympia and spend a few days with us, you would realize how closely the Republicans and the Democrats actually work together and talk to each other. We socialize with each other. We have become friends with each other because we both realize nothing will happen in this state without both parties working together. And we have a long tradition of that, and especially here in the 45th district. Even when this district was represented by a split of Republicans and Democrats, we always had joint town halls. We always had joint legislation. We worked together. That's how we put this democracy back together again. And I look forward to hearing more from all of you. I would just mirror my colleagues' comments that it has been a privilege for the last 18 years to be your representative. So thanks for the evening tonight.
And that'll be all. Thank you for attending tonight's event. If you did not get your question answered, you can contact member offices directly via email or phone. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.
Good night, guys.